Picture a glass bottle in the shape of a flattened oval, about the size of your hand, with a narrow neck at one end. Attached to that neck is a long, thin rubber tube, perhaps 18 inches in length, snaking downward from the bottle to a rubber nipple at the other end. The tube is dark with age and use, stained by the residue of 100 feedings, its interior coated with a film of dried milk that has soured and thickened into a crust. If you were to hold this tube up to the light, you would see that the rubber has become opaque, discolored, pocked with tiny holes where bacteria have eaten into the material itself, creating cavities and crevices that no amount of washing could ever reach. And if you were to cut the tube open, the smell that would meet you would be unmistakable, the sour, rotten, stomach-turning stench of milk that has been fermenting inside a sealed tube for days or weeks, a stew of bacteria so concentrated that a single feeding from this device could, and regularly did, kill the infant who drank from it. This was not a medieval torture instrument. This was not a weapon. This was a baby bottle. It was the standard, commercially available, widely recommended infant feeding device, sold across Britain and America from roughly 1860 to 1900, purchased by loving mothers for their newborn children, endorsed by doctors, advertised in newspapers, and sold in pharmacies with cheerful illustrations of healthy, plump babies on the packaging. It was called, by the manufacturers and the shops that sold it, the feeding bottle. It was called, by the doctors who eventually understood what it was doing, the murder bottle. And for 40 years, it killed infants by the thousands. Subscribe to Historia Survival and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because this is the story of what it meant to feed a baby before anyone understood germs, and the answer is more horrifying than you expect. To understand how the murder bottle came to exist and how it came to be so widely used despite being so catastrophically dangerous, you have to understand what infant feeding was like before the modern era. For most of human history, the answer to the question of how you fed a baby was simple and absolute. You breastfed it. There was no alternative. If a mother could not breastfeed because of illness, because of death in childbirth, because of insufficient milk supply, the options were stark and limited. You found another woman who could nurse the child, a wet nurse, either a relative, a friend, or, if you were wealthy, a hired professional, or the child died. Those were the options. There was no formula. There was no safe way to give an infant anything other than human milk. The alternatives that desperate families tried, animal milk from cows or goats or donkeys, pap made from bread soaked in water, sugar water, thin gruel, were all inadequate in nutrition and frequently contaminated with the bacteria that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of pre-modern kitchens. The infant mortality rates of the pre-industrial era reflected this reality with brutal clarity. In many European cities before the 19th century, between 20 and 40% of all children born alive died before their first birthday. In foundling homes, where orphaned and abandoned infants were fed on artificial substitutes because no wet nurses were available in sufficient numbers, the death rate could exceed 80 or 90%. These institutions, established with charitable intent to save the lives of unwanted children, were in practice little more than waiting rooms for death. because the food they offered their charges was not food in any meaningful sense. It was a slow poison of contamination and malnutrition that killed almost every child who received it. The invention of the rubber nipple in the 1840s and 50s, and the mass production of glass baby bottles in the same era, was supposed to change all of this. The idea was straightforward and, on its face, reasonable. If you could create a device that mimicked the breast, a container for milk with a soft, nipple-shaped attachment that the baby could suck on, you could feed infants without a wet nurse, without the expense and the social complications of hiring another woman to nurse your child, without the vulnerability of depending on a single woman's body and health and availability for the survival of your baby. The bottle was progress. It was modernity. It was freedom from the biological constraint that had bound women and infants together since the beginning of the species. The wet nurse system, which had sustained infants whose mothers could not breastfeed for thousands of years, was itself under enormous pressure by the middle of the 19th century. The rapidly growing industrial cities of Britain and America, the traditional networks of family and community that had supplied wet nurses for generations, were breaking down. Women who might once have nursed a neighbor's child were now working in factories, their own health compromised by the brutal conditions of industrial labor. The wealthy could still hire wet nurses, and they did, but the cost was substantial, and the arrangement carried its own risks. The wet nurse might be unhealthy, might drink, might have diseases that could be transmitted through her milk, might simply leave without notice and disappear. For working-class families, hiring a wet nurse was often impossible. The alternative was artificial feeding, and artificial feeding required a device. The early bottles were simple: a glass vessel with a cork or screw top and a rubber nipple attached directly to the opening. These were difficult to clean, but at least possible to wash thoroughly, because the nipple could be removed, and the interior of the bottle could be reached with a brush. But they had a problem. The baby had to be held at an angle while feeding, and the mother had to hold the bottle the entire time, which was inconvenient, tiring, and, for working women in the factories and workshops of industrial Britain, often impossible. A woman who had to work 12 hours a day in a mill could not stop every few hours to hold a bottle at the correct angle for 20 minutes while her baby fed. The long tube bottle was the solution to this problem. Its genius, its deadly, catastrophic genius, was that it could be propped up in the cradle next to the baby and left unattended. The long rubber tube carried the milk from the bottle, which could be positioned anywhere, to the nipple in the baby's mouth, and the baby could suck at its own pace without anyone holding anything. The mother could fill the bottle in the morning, place it in the cradle, and leave for work. The baby would feed itself throughout the day, sucking milk through the long tube whenever it was hungry, and the mother would refill the bottle when she returned in the evening. If you are already sensing the horror of what comes next, subscribe to Historia Survival, because this channel exists for exactly these moments when the ordinary practice of daily life conceals something monstrous. Now stay with me. The problem was the tube. The problem was always the tube. An 18-inch rubber tube filled with milk, left at room temperature for hours, is a perfect incubator for bacterial growth. Milk is one of the most nutritious substances on Earth, not only for human infants, but for every microorganism that encounters it. At room temperature, bacteria begin multiplying in milk within minutes of exposure. Within hours, the bacterial count in unrefrigerated milk can reach levels that are actively dangerous to an adult digestive system, let alone the fragile, undeveloped gut of a newborn infant. And the tube of the murder bottle was never properly cleaned. It could not be properly cleaned. The rubber was opaque. The interior was invisible. The tube was too narrow and too long for any brush or cloth to reach through its full length. The connections between the tube and the bottle, and between the tube and the nipple, created crevices and joints where milk residue accumulated and rotted undisturbed. The advice given to mothers about cleaning these bottles is, in retrospect, almost unbelievable in its negligence. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, the most widely read domestic guide of the Victorian era, advised that the rubber nipple need not be washed for 2 or 3 weeks. Other guides recommended drawing a piece of string through the tube to remove visible residue, a method that was entirely inadequate for removing the bacterial film that coated the interior of the rubber. Some mothers, following the advice of their own mothers or of the shopkeepers who sold the bottles, simply rinsed the tube in water between feedings and considered it clean. The rubber itself, being porous and organic, was impossible to sterilize. Bacteria grew not only on the surface of the tube, but within the material itself, eating into the rubber, creating pockets and cavities that harbored colonies of pathogens no washing could reach, and the mothers did not know. That is the part of this story that makes it truly terrible, the absolute, crushing innocence of the women who used these bottles. They did not know about germs. They could not see bacteria. They could not smell the difference between milk that was merely sour and milk that was lethally contaminated. They trusted the advice they were given by shopkeepers and doctors and household manuals. They trusted the product because it was sold openly, because it was popular, because everyone they knew used the same thing. A mother in Manchester or Birmingham in 1875, buying a long tube feeding bottle for her newborn, was not making a negligent choice. She was making the only choice available to her within the information and the economic constraints of her world. She was trying to keep her baby alive while also keeping herself alive, while working the 12-hour shifts that put food on the table, while managing a household in conditions of poverty and exhaustion that most modern people cannot fully imagine. The result was predictable, inevitable, and devastating. Babies fed from long tube bottles developed diarrhea. They developed vomiting. They developed the gastroenteritis that was, in Victorian Britain, the single leading cause of infant death. The diarrhea dehydrated them. The vomiting prevented them from absorbing any nutrition. Within days, a healthy infant who had been thriving on breast milk or even on carefully prepared artificial feeds could be reduced to a limp, feverish, dehydrated shell, dying of an infection contracted from the very device that was supposed to nourish and sustain it. The doctors of the era did not immediately understand the connection. Germ theory was still new in the 1860s and 70s, still not universally accepted, still not fully understood even by many physicians who had heard of it. The prevailing explanation for infant diarrhea was not bacterial contamination, but rather the quality of the milk itself, or the weakness of the infant's constitution, or the heat of the summer weather, or any of a dozen other theories that did not implicate the feeding device. Mothers who lost babies to gastroenteritis were told that the child had been weak, that the milk had been bad, that the weather had been too hot, that nothing could have been done. They were not told that the bottle they had purchased from a reputable shop, on the recommendation of a reputable doctor, was delivering a concentrated dose of lethal bacteria directly into their baby's stomach with every feeding. By the 1880s, the connection was becoming clear to the more observant physicians. Doctors in British cities began publishing papers noting the correlation between artificial feeding, particularly feeding with long tube bottles, and infant gastroenteritis. The term murder bottle began appearing in medical literature, a deliberate, provocative label chosen by physicians who wanted to shock the public and the profession into recognizing the danger. Some doctors campaigned openly for the bottles to be banned. Others lobbied for better education about cleaning and sterilization. A few particularly forward-thinking physicians began advocating for the abandonment of the long tube design entirely, arguing that no amount of cleaning advice could make the device safe because the fundamental design, a long, narrow, opaque tube that could never be adequately sterilized, was inherently and irredeemably dangerous. The resistance to these warnings was substantial. The manufacturers of long tube bottles had a profitable product and no desire to see it removed from the market. Shopkeepers who sold the bottles defended them. Many mothers, particularly working-class women, who depended on the convenience of a self-feeding bottle to allow them to work, resisted the idea that the device they relied on was harming their children. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. Accepting that the murder bottle was truly dangerous meant accepting that you had been poisoning your own child, that the device you had purchased with love and good intention had been delivering death with every feeding, and that the babies you had lost to summer diarrhea, the babies you had grieved and buried, had died because of something you had done, however innocently, however ignorantly. The statistics tell the story with a coldness that is almost unbearable. In the late Victorian period, in the industrial cities of northern England, infant mortality rates reached levels that are difficult for a modern person to comprehend. In some working-class districts, 1 in 4 babies died before their first birthday. Some of the worst areas, the figure was 1 in 3. Summer was the killing season, the months when warm temperatures accelerated the growth of bacteria in stored milk, when the tubes of the murder bottles became breeding grounds for pathogens that multiplied with explosive speed in the heat. Doctors noticed the pattern year after year. Infant deaths spiked in June, July, and August, peaking in the hottest weeks, dropping off as autumn brought cooler temperatures and slowed the bacterial growth. They called it summer diarrhea, and it killed thousands of babies every year. And the long tube bottle was, if not the sole cause, then one of the primary delivery mechanisms for the bacteria that did the killing. The social class dimension was stark. Wealthy families, who could afford wet nurses, or who had servants to sterilize bottles and prepare fresh feeds multiple times a day, lost far fewer infants to summer diarrhea, Working-class families who depended on the long tube bottle precisely because its convenience allowed mothers to work suffered the highest death rates. The murder bottle was, in this sense, a class weapon, a device whose danger fell disproportionately on the poor, on the families least able to afford alternatives, and least likely to have access to the medical knowledge that might have saved their children. The bottles were eventually driven from the market in the early 20th century, not by a single dramatic act of legislation or a single devastating exposés, but by the slow, grinding accumulation of medical evidence, public health campaigns, improved bottle designs that eliminated the tube, and the gradual spread of understanding about bacterial contamination and the importance of sterilization. In France, the public health response came earlier and more aggressively than in Britain. French authorities, alarmed by infant mortality statistics that threatened the nation's population growth, established a network of goutte de lait, milk depots, where mothers could obtain pasteurized milk and sterile feeding equipment, and where trained nurses taught proper bottle preparation and hygiene. The French example demonstrated that the problem could be solved, that infant mortality could be dramatically reduced when mothers were given access to clean milk and safe feeding devices. But in Britain, where laissez-faire economics and suspicion of government intervention delayed public health measures for decades, the long tube bottle continued to be sold and used long after the French had largely eliminated it from their nurseries. By the 1920s, the long tube bottle had largely disappeared, replaced by wide-necked glass bottles with detachable nipples that could be boiled, brushed, and properly sterilized between feedings. Drop a comment if this has changed the way you think about something as simple as a baby bottle, and subscribe to Historia Survival so you never miss what we uncover next, because the legacy of the murder bottle is not just historical. It is a warning about the distance between good intention and lethal consequence. Some of these bottles survive today in museum collections and in the hands of private collectors. They are small, delicate, often beautiful objects, made of hand-blown glass in graceful shapes, their rubber tubes long since deteriorated and discarded. Looking at them behind glass, you would never guess what they were or what they did. They look like curiosities, like quaint relics of a more innocent age. Objects you might admire for their craftsmanship. They are anything but innocent. The murder bottle was not invented by villains. It was not sold by people who wanted to harm children. It was designed by engineers who were trying to solve a genuine problem, manufactured by companies that believed in their product, sold by shopkeepers who recommended it in good faith, and purchased by mothers who loved their babies and wanted to feed them safely and conveniently. Every person in that chain, from the designer to the mother, was acting with good intention, and the result was the mass death of infants on a scale that is difficult to comprehend from the safety of our modern era. The lesson of the murder bottle is not about evil. It is about ignorance, about the gap between what people believe they know and what is actually true, about the terrifying speed with which a well-intentioned innovation can become an instrument of harm when the science needed to evaluate it does not yet exist. The mothers of Victorian Britain did not know about bacteria. They did not know about sterilization. They did not know that milk left in a warm rubber tube for hours became a lethal broth of pathogens. They knew only that the bottle was sold in shops, that doctors did not warn against it, that their neighbors used it, that it was convenient and affordable and allowed them to work while their babies fed, and that sometimes babies died, as babies had always died, for reasons that no one fully understood. The next time you sterilize a baby bottle or read the cleaning instructions on infant feeding equipment, or see a modern bottle with its wide neck and its dishwasher-safe components and its transparent materials designed for easy inspection, understand what you are looking at. You are looking at the ghost of the murder bottle. You are looking at a design that exists in its current form, specifically because a previous design killed children, specifically because doctors in the 1880s fought for decades to make the public understand that a device sold as safe was anything but, and specifically because the slow machinery of public health, of education, of regulation, eventually ground forward far enough to remove a lethal product from the hands of the mothers who trusted it. Every modern baby bottle is a monument to the infants who died drinking from tubes that no one told their mothers were poisonous. Every sterilization instruction is an echo of the murder bottle's long and terrible reign.